"You will go to Pevensey," her father said, "and you will answer for what your brother has done. Because God knows none of the rest of us has the stomach for it." Margaret Holt did not look up from the chart she was folding into her traveling case. She had read the shipwright's letter 3 times by lamplight the night before, and she already now understood well enough what her family wanted of her. That she go to the great yard at Pevensey, stand before its owner, and account for a debt her brother had signed them into, as though debts were nothing more than ink that dried and was forgotten. The morning came damp and grey through the kitchen window, the smell of tar and brine drifting up from the harbour below the house, and that smell settled over the half-packed case like a verdict already passed. "He sent for father," Margaret said, smoothing a chart flat before she rolled it. "Not me. Your father can't climb 3 stairs without his chest seizing on him, and well you know it." Her mother pressed a handkerchief to her lip, though the morning wasn't yet warm enough to account for the gesture. "He'll arrive at Pevensey, wheezing and beg, where a man ought to negotiate, and Mr. Mashford will have his answer before a word of business is spoken. And Tom—" The handkerchief went still. Through the floor came the muffled creak of her brother's bed, and the particular silence of a man who had not left his room before noon in a fortnight. Tom had come back from the shipping office in the spring, with a contract he had no business signing on the family's behalf. A promise to deliver 400 feet of seasoned oak to the Ashford yard by midsummer. Oak the Holt timber lots simply did not hold. Not in that quantity, not in that quality, whatever Tom had told the yard's owner to secure the order. "Tom," her mother said, "will not be discussed." Margaret turned at last. Her mother stood framed against the window, still handsome despite the grey now thick at her temples, her jaw set in the particular line that meant the matter had already been settled, in rooms Margaret had not been invited into. "He didn't write to be charmed, Mother. He wrote because 400 feet of oak that doesn't exist is a debt of nearly £600, and a man doesn't forgive £600 because a pretty face apologizes for it prettily. Which is precisely why," her mother said, "I am sending you with the books, and your sister with her face." There it was. Margaret felt the whole shape of the plan settle into place, cold and complete, the way a key turns its last quarter, and the bolt slides home. She would carry the ledgers and the apologies, and the arithmetic of their ruin, into Josiah Ashford's office. Eliza would carry her dark eyes and her soft voice, and between the two of them the family hoped to walk away with the debt forgiven, and perhaps an understanding besides. "You mean for him to take a fancy to Eliza. I mean for him to see her. He's 32, unmarried, with that whole yard and no one waiting for him at the end of a day's work. He'll see her, and the rest will follow as it generally does. You have only to smooth the ground ahead of her. Be useful, Margaret. Be quiet. Be quick. You've always managed those 3 things admirably. Whatever else got left out of you. It should not have stung, after 26 years of the same tune. It stung anyway. Margaret took the case back from her mother's apron, before the woman could crease the charts folded inside it, because her own hands needed something to hold that would not answer back. "The coach leaves at 8, she said. "I'll want the survey instruments as well as the ledgers. If I'm meant to smooth the ground, I'd rather not do it blind." The road to Pevensey ran along the coast through a morning gone the color of old pewter, gulls working the grey water below the cliff line, the smell of salt and tar growing stronger as the wheels carried them down toward the harbour. Eliza slept against the squabs across from her, one gloved hand fallen open in her lap, the very picture of a young woman who had never once needed to learn what her own hands were for, besides, looking well in gloves. Margaret sat with the case of ledgers balanced on her knees and watched the cliffs slide past, doing arithmetic in her head that had nothing to do with the road and everything to do with the clef. Conversation that waited at the end of it. The Ashford yard came into view, the way the great works always did, announcing itself well before the house. A long stretch of slipways and timber stacks running down to the water. 3. Half-finished hulls standing in their cradles like the ribs of something not yet decided whether it would live, the whole place ringing faintly with the sound of adzes and mallets, even from this distance. Margaret had grown up half a mile from a smaller yard than this one, had spent her childhood watching her own father loft hull lines onto the floor of his drafting loft before his chest gave out and took the work from him a stick at a time, and something in her settled, despite the morning's dread, at the familiar smell of fresh-cut oak and pitch. They were received not at the front of the house but at the office, attached to the yard itself. A long plain room hung with half-finished drawings, and a single great chart of the harbor, approaches pinned across one whole wall. Josiah Ashford kept them waiting the better part of 20 minutes, time Eliza spent arranging for bonnet ribbons, and Margaret spent studying the chart on the wall, tracing the harbor's shoals with her eye, the way she'd been taught since girlhood, until she found herself standing close enough to read the soundings marked along the channel mouth. "You've an interest in the chart, Miss Holt, or merely something to occupy your hands while you wait?" She turned. He had come in quietly, a tall man in shirt sleeves with sawdust still caught in the creases of his cuffs, his face weathered in the particular way of men who spent more hours on a slipway than behind a desk, though the desk in this room was plainly his. He looked, Margaret thought, like a man who had been measuring something all morning, and resented the interruption before the figure came out right. Eliza rose and performed her curtsy beautifully, the way she performed everything, like a note held exactly as long as it ought to be held. Josiah Ashford looked at her, for precisely as long as courtesy required, and not a moment longer. Then his eyes went to Margaret, to the case of ledgers still in her arms because she'd refused to let the coachman carry it, and something moved behind his expression that she couldn't name and didn't trust. "I expected your father," he said. His voice was low and level, an old workingman's voice with no softness worn into it. "Or your brother, since it's his signature on the contract I'm holding. My father's chest won't allow the journey, sir, and my brother lacked the courage to make it. I've brought the accounts instead, 3 years of them, and the original contract, and a survey of what timber our lots actually hold, set against what he promised you." A silence settled over the room. Out past the window, the adzes went on ringing against green wood, indifferent to debts and dukedoms both. Eliza's smile had begun, very slightly, to fix in place. "You brought the accounts," Ashford said. "I brought the whole of it, sir. A debt is easier discussed with the figures laid plain on the table than hidden underneath it." For a moment Margaret thought she had ruined the whole errand in the first 30 seconds, that her mother's careful plan had cracked open beneath her, before Eliza had managed a single word of her own. Then Ashford's mouth moved, not quite a smile, something closer to a man recognizing a tool he hadn't expected to find lying ready to hand. "Sit then, Miss Holt, and show me what you've brought, since you've gone to the trouble of carrying it this far yourself." He did not once look toward Eliza again that morning. If you've ever watched a room finally notice the person who actually does the work, instead of the one who simply looks well doing nothing, pour some tea, get comfortable, because this is exactly that story. The accounts took the better part of 2 hours to go through properly. Ashford asking sharp, exacting questions Margaret answered, without once needing to consult the ledgers, having kept half of them in her own hand for the better part of 3 years, while her father's chest worsened, and someone in the family needed to mind the figures whether anyone troubled to thank her for it or not. 400 feet your brother promised," Ashford said finally, setting down the contract. "Your own survey shows perhaps 110 feet of timber, fit for the purpose, and not a board more, whatever Tom Holt told my clerk to secure the order. That's the truth of it, sir. I won't pretend otherwise to make the morning easier. Most families in your position would pretend otherwise at considerable length. Most families haven't sat across a table from a man, holding their ruin in his hand, and decided arithmetic was worth more to him than apology. I judged you for exactly that sort of man, within the first minute of this conversation, sir. And I'll own I'm gambling the whole of my family's standing on having judged you correctly. Something that might, in a less guarded man, have been amusement crossed Ashford's face, and was gone again, before it had fully arrived. And if you've judged me wrong, then we're considerably worse off than we were this morning, and I'll have wasted both our time, instead of merely mine. He studied her a long moment. The chart of the harbor approaches at his back, the adzes still ringing faint through the window glass. The 110 feet you can supply, I'll take at fair price, against what's owed. The remainder of the debt I'll hold against future timber, delivered as your lots actually yield it. Properly surveyed each season, rather than promised wholesale, by a man with no head for what he not. That's not forgiveness, Miss Holt. It's simply a debt structured by someone who understands what can actually be paid. That's considerably more generous than I came prepared to hope for. It's not generosity, it's good business, conducted with someone who brought me true figures instead of a pretty apology. His glance flicked, briefly, toward Eliza, still seated by the window with her bonnet ribbons and her patient, increasingly puzzled smile. No offense intended to your sister. None taken on her behalf, I expect, sir. Though you'd want to ask her that yourself, rather than take my word for it. He almost smiled at that, the corner of his mouth moving before he caught it back into something more businesslike. Mrs. Briggs will show you both to rooms for the night, since the return road's too long to manage before dark. You'll dine with me at 7, Miss Holt, and bring the survey papers. I want to walk the question of next season's yield properly, not merely take your word against the ledger. He rose, already shrugging out of his coat before he'd fully reached the office door, the particular gesture of a man whose mind had already returned to whatever half-finished hull waited for him down on the slipway. Eliza stared after him, her pretty mouth open on a pleasantry that had found no occasion to be spoken. Well, she said at last, faintly, he's certainly abrupt. But Margaret was watching the line of his shoulders as he crossed the yard toward the nearest cradle, and found she minded the abruptness rather less than she probably ought to have. Dinner that evening was a smaller, plainer affair than Margaret had expected of a man who owned Phineas, the largest yard on that stretch of coast. 3 places set at a table in a room, hung with half-finished ships, plans rather than family portraits, the food simple and well-cooked, and served without ceremony. Eliza, seated to Ashford's right, made several careful attempts at conversation about the weather and the journey down from home. Each one answered politely and briefly, before Ashford's attention drifted, with what Margaret suspected was no particular unkindness intended, back toward whichever paper sat nearest his elbow. It was only once the plates had been cleared, and the survey papers spread across the table, in their place, that the evening properly came alive. Your father trained you to this, Ashford said, watching her trace the timber lot's boundaries against his own chart of the coastline, fitting one survey against the other with the easy, unhurried precision of long practice. The drafting, the soundings. This isn't a skill a woman picks up minding a household. My father lofted hull lines for 30 years before his chest gave out and took the standing, from under him, a board at a time. I sat at his drafting table from the time I was old enough to hold a pencil steady, because I was the one who liked sitting there, and a father teaches what's asked of him, whatever the asking looks like coming from a daughter instead of a son. And your brother? My brother liked the shipping office better than the drafting loft, and the tavern better than either. And somewhere in the liking of those two things, he forgot that a contract is a debt before it's ever an opportunity. She set the survey down. I don't say that to shame him further than he's already shamed himself, sir. Only to be plain with you about which one of us actually understands what your yard requires, and which one of us merely understands how to sign a letter promising it. Ashford was quiet a long moment, turning that over the way he seemed to turn over most things before answering. I've had a great many men sit at this table over the years promising me timber they hadn't troubled to survey first. I don't believe I've ever had a woman sit here and survey it properly, before troubling me with the promise at all. Then perhaps you've been keeping company with the wrong sort of timber merchant, sir. He laughed at that, short and startled, entirely unguarded. The first sound she'd heard from him all evening, that hadn't been carefully measured first. Eliza, watching from across the table, said nothing at all. Her expression caught somewhere between confusion and the dawning, faintly wounded, understanding that the evening had stopped including her some while ago without her quite noticing the moment it happened. Margaret and Eliza stayed at Pevensey 3 days longer than the original errand required, Ashford finding reason after reason to walk the timber question through again, to compare this season's survey against the last, to ask Margaret's opinion on a hull's framing in a way that had, by the second day, very little remaining to do with debts or contracts at all. Eliza, for her part, grew quieter as the visit wore on, watching her sister become, without any apparent effort, the person in the room whose opinion Ashford actually sought, while her own carefully arranged conversation drew politely diminishing returns. She caught Margaret alone on the second evening, in the narrow hallway outside their shared rooms, candle in hand, her face arranged into something careful, rather than openly accusing. You weren't sent here to draw his attention, Margaret. You were sent to settle the debt. I am settling the debt, Eliza. I've done nothing this whole visit, but exactly what I was sent to do. You know that isn't the whole of what I mean. Margaret set down the survey papers she'd been carrying back to her room, and looked at her sister properly, weighing how much honesty the hallway could bear at that hour. I haven't done a single thing to draw his attention, beyond bringing him true figures instead of a pleasant apology. If that's drawn more notice than your face has managed in 3 days, Eliza, I don't know that the fault lies with me for having brought it. Eliza's mouth tightened, the careful arrangement of her expression slipping for just a moment into something rawer. Mother sent me to be looked at. I know precisely what I was sent here to do, same as you. It isn't pleasant, being told plainly, which of your own talents the family considers worth exporting. It was, Margaret realized, the first entirely honest thing her sister had said to her in longer way than she could readily recall, and she found she had no easy answer ready for it. I'm sorry for that, she said finally. I mean it plainly, not as a kindness. I don't think either of us asked to be sorted the way Mother's sorted us, and I don't think either of us has had much say in changing it before now. Eliza studied her a long moment, then nodded once, something easing slightly in her shoulders. No, I don't suppose either of us has. They didn't speak of it again that visit, but something had shifted between them regardless. The old careless distance of two sisters raised to compete for a single family's, and narrow notice softening, just slightly, into something that might, given time, become an actual understanding. The third morning brought a setback that nearly undid 3 days of careful progress. A storm had moved through overnight, and word came up from the yard before breakfast that one of the slipway cradles had shifted in the wind, threatening the half-finished hull resting in it. A vessel Ashford had been 6 months building for a merchant client who would not, by any reasonable account, take kindly to news of damage. Margaret was at the table with her coffee still untouched when Ashford strode through, already half into his coat, his face set in the particular grim focus of a man calculating losses before he've even reached the problem itself. How bad? She asked, rising before she'd quite decided to. Bad enough. The cradle shifted a full foot at the bow end. If she comes down off true before we can shore it, I'm looking at weeks of work undone, and a client who'll want explanations I haven't got time to invent prettily. Show me. He hesitated, the old wariness flickering back into his expression for just a moment, the habit of 6 years running a yard alone, reasserting itself before he caught it back. This isn't timber surveys, Miss Holt. This is load and angle, and a hull that could come down wrong if it's handled carelessly. I've watched my father shore a listing keel twice in my childhood, sir, and held the chalk line both times while he worked out the angle. I'm not asking to swing a mallet. I'm asking to look and tell you plainly if I see something your own eyes too tired and too frightened to catch this morning. He studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp, and they went down to the yard together, at a pace that left Eliza, trailing curiously behind in the doorway, entirely forgotten. The cradle had indeed shifted, the great hull leaning a degree or two off true, 3 of Ashford's men already working ropes and timber braces beneath the bow, while a 4th shouted instructions that contradicted the first 3. Margaret stood back from the chaos a long moment, tracing the angle of the lean against the angle of the original cradle marks still visible in the mud, doing the same quiet arithmetic she'd done over ledgers and survey lines for years, except now, the sum being worked was wood, and weight, and gravity, instead of pounds and feet of timber. Your men are bracing from the wrong side, she said finally, raising her voice enough to carry over the wind. The leans toward the water, not away from it. Brace from the landward side, and you're fighting the same force twice instead of once. Ashford's head turned sharply toward her, and for one long moment, she thought she'd overstepped badly, inserted herself into a yard's business in front of his own men, in a way no woman ever had reason to. Then he looked back at the hull, traced the angle himself, and swore, short and sharp, the particular oath of a man recognizing a true thing he should have seen unassisted. Landward side. He shouted to his men. All of you, now. Landward braces. She's leaning toward the water. The work went considerably faster after that, the hull easing back toward true within the hour, secured properly, before the tide could complicate matters further. Ashford stood beside Margaret afterward, in the thinning rain, both of them mud to the ankles, watching the braced hull settle into its corrected angle. You've just saved me 6 months of work, and a client I'd have had considerable trouble explaining myself to, he said, not looking at her directly, his attention still fixed on the hull. I don't know that I've ever had a morning quite like this one. My father used to say a true line doesn't care whose hand finds it, sir, only that someone bothers to look properly before the wood comes down wrong. Your father sounds like he taught you a great deal more than timber surveys. He taught me most of what's worth knowing, though he never once managed to teach my brother the difference between a promise and a debt. And I don't believe that particular lesson is mine to give a second try at, however much the family might wish otherwise. Ashford laughed at that, the sound carrying out over the wet yard, and something in his expression, watching her, had settled into a kind of plain, unguarded regard that hadn't been there 3 days before. A letter arrived from her mother that same afternoon, the post having caught up with them at last, and Margaret read it standing in the yard office with mud still drying on her hem. Ashford, pretending an interest in a nearby chart, while plainly listening for whatever news the letter carried. Your father is anxious to know whether the debt is settled, and whether you mean to return before the week is out, her mother had written. In the brisk, slanting hand Margaret had known her whole life. I trust you have not made yourself a nuisance to Mr. Ashford with your ledgers and your surveys. Your sister's purpose there is plain enough, and I would not have you crowd it through some misplaced eagerness to be useful. Come home directly the business is concluded, Margaret, and bring Honoria with her prospects intact, whatever else you bring back with you. Margaret folded the letter slowly, aware of Ashford's attention even with his back half turned toward her. Bad news? He asked, not quite managing to sound as though he hadn't been waiting to ask it. My mother would like to know whether I've made myself a nuisance to you, sir, with my ledgers and my surveys, and whether I mean to come home directly, and bring my sister's prospects back intact. And what do you intend to tell her? Margaret looked at the letter a long moment, then at the yard beyond the window, the braced hull standing corrected in its cradle, the men already back at work on the planking, as though the morning's crisis had never happened at all. I intend to tell her the business isn't yet concluded, sir, and that I'd rather finish it properly than rush home to satisfy an impatience that was never really about the debt to begin with. That's not quite an answer to what I asked. No, she admitted. It isn't. I find I haven't entirely decided what the honest answer is yet, and I'd rather not write it down for my mother to read before I've settled it for myself. He studied her a moment, then nodded, satisfied with that much honesty, even where the fuller truth hadn't yet been spoken, and turned back to his chart, though Margaret noticed, for the rest of that afternoon, that his attention strayed rather more often toward her end of the office than toward the chart itself. If you've ever had to watch a sibling get sorted into a role they never chose any more than you chose yours, you already know this part isn't really about the Duke, or the timber, in this case. Stay with me a while longer. The matter of the debt was settled formally on the morning of the 4th day, papers drawn and signed in Ashford's office, the original contract torn through and replaced with terms Margaret had helped draft herself, survey by survey, season by season, structured around what the Holt timber lots could actually bear, rather than what Tom's careless signature had once promised. It was, by any sober reckoning, a considerably better outcome than the family had any right to expect when Margaret had packed her case 3 days before. I should thank you properly before we go, sir, she said, the carriage already being readied in the yard below. You've been considerably more patient with my family's cause than the original contract gave you any cause to be. I haven't been patient with your family's trouble, Miss Holt. I've been patient because the figures you brought me were honest, and an honest figure is worth a great deal more of my patience than a dishonest apology ever would be. He stood at the office window, watching the carriage being loaded below. I find I'm considerably less interested in concluding this business than I expected to be 3 days ago. That's an odd thing for a man to say about settling a debt in his favor. It's not the debt I find myself reluctant to conclude. He turned from the window to look at her directly. The careful, measuring expression she'd grown used to over 3 days giving way to something plainer. I've run this yard alone for 6 years, Miss Holt. Since my father died and left it to me, along with every debt he hadn't troubled to mention before dying. I've had no shortage of families bringing daughters through that office door in the time since, each one arranged a little more carefully than the last to catch my notice. You're the first one who walked in with a survey instead of a smile, and I find, 3 days on, that the survey has done considerably more to hold my attention than any smile has managed in 6 years. Margaret stood very still, the carriage bell ringing faintly from the yard below, and found she had nothing clever ready to set against that, which she counted, privately, as its own kind of answer. I came here to settle my brother's debt, sir. I hadn't any plan beyond that when I packed my case. I'm not asking you to have arrived with a plan. I'm asking whether you'd consider staying long enough to make one, now that the debt's no longer standing between us as the only reason to keep talking. She looked at him a long moment, the weight of 26 years of being sorted into the useful, quiet, quick category settling differently now than it ever had at her mother's kitchen table, lighter somehow, now that someone had finally found the sorting itself worth questioning. I'd want to finish the season's survey first, she said, properly, the way it ought to be done, not rushed because a carriage is waiting in the yard. I'd expect nothing less thorough from you, Miss Holt. Then perhaps, she said, I'll write to my mother that the visit wants extending. They married the following spring at the small church above the harbor, the same church Margaret had attended every Sunday of her childhood, close enough to the yard that the sound of adzes against green wood carried faintly through the open windows during the ceremony itself, which neither of them minded in the slightest. Eliza stood beside her sister that day, not as an afterthought this time, but as the one Margaret had asked first. The old careless distance between them, long since mended into something steadier. The two of them having spent the better part of a year writing letters back and forth that had nothing to do with debts or duchies, and everything to do with simply knowing each other properly for the first tips. And 26 years, Eliza had found her own use for herself in that year besides, having discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, a genuine talent for managing the household accounts their mother had never once let her near, and took to the work with the particular fierce satisfaction of someone finally handed a task that asked something real of her rather than merely asking her to be looked at. Tom never did fully settle his debt to the family's good opinion, though Ashford's revised terms gave him no further opportunity to compound it. The timber lots surveyed honestly each season from then on, by Margaret's own hand whenever the work allowed her the time, and by a steward's afterward. Once other duties at Pevensey came to occupy more of her days than timber alone could fill. 5 years on, the office at the Ashford yard held 2 drafting tables instead of 1, set side by side beneath the great chart of the harbour approaches, Margaret's table marked with the particular clutter of a woman who had never once stopped working since the day she'd first walked through that door with a case of ledgers in her arms. "You're at the lines again before breakfast," Josiah said, finding her there one frostbright morning, their young son asleep against his shoulder, their daughter tracing a finger along the harbour chart with the fierce concentration of a girl, thoroughly convinced she was charting something of genuine importance. "The Pelham contract won't loft itself, whatever the hour happens to be. I've told you more than once, you needn't be at the table before the sun's properly up." "I've always been at the table before the sun's properly up, Josiah. You married a woman who does that. I don't see why becoming Mrs. B. Ashford ought to have changed it." He smiled, the old measuring wariness long since gone from around his eyes, and crossed to the window, looking out over a yard that had grown, in 5 years, into the busiest works on that whole stretch of coast, slipways full, the ring of adzes carrying, clear across the harbour, most mornings before the gulls had even properly woken. Their daughter held up a small wooden hull model with great solemnity. "Papa, it's ready for her lines." "Is it?" Josiah said, biting back a smile of his own. "And where's she bound, then?" "Everywhere," the girl said, as though the answer should have been entirely obvious to anyone paying proper attention, and went back to her important work, while her parents exchanged a look that needed, by then, no further translation between them at all. Margaret kept the old survey case, the very one she'd carried up the Ashford steps that first grey morning, on a shelf above her drafting table, empty now of any practical use, kept close simply because some things were worth remembering exactly how far a person could travel, one honest figure at a time, toward a morning ordinary enough, at last, to need no further proving at all. If this one kept you good company tonight, stay a while longer. Tell me in the comments which sister you'd have sent up those steps first, and I'll have another story waiting for you whenever you're ready for it.